All right, this is preliminary remarks to Liber ABA or ABA or ABBA. ABBA. I prefer ABA. I don't know why. It's just how I originally read it. But Monday, January 4th, 2016. And this was just the beginning of pretty much most of book 4. There's like one section, I think, that from the notes that I want to eventually still read. It's like an appendix. I don't know, I've just been holding off because I wanted to finish the whole book and do all these other Libers and then read this whole blog. So I still plan on getting to the Key of the Mysteries and pretty much everything else I haven't gotten to, at least read aloud. But I said today, Monday, January 4th, 2016, I'm reading the beginning of Liber ABA, or ABBA, with the exception of the editor's introduction from my copy, which is subject to copyright. I begin with a note by Soror Viricam, who greatly helped Crowley to compose the Liber. One star in sight, the poem follows briefly leading into the preliminary remark. And again, this book, even though finding out book 4 is 444, especially the first section on mysticism, I associated very heavily with. I mean, I did psychedelics, I've done them, DMT, LSD, mushrooms, but for whatever reason, the DMT trip, even though they only last like 8 to 10 minutes and the full, they last total like 30 minutes as far as making you feel strange, but it takes a while to come back to normal, I guess. But I did it as experimental research, I guess you could say. I even let other people do it and tried to record their experiences and just to get different opinions. And having not read any sort of mystical literature, or at least on yoga or the East, whenever I did come across Crowley's Magic and then also 8 lectures on yoga, I hadn't even done any psychedelics in years, I instantly had a sort of memory, I guess, or I just remembered all the events as I was reading mysticism and 8 lectures on yoga, and I realized how heavily the breath and just breathing really ties in with all that. I don't know. It's very difficult to explain. It's pretty much explained in the literature itself. But it was just profound. It caused me to realize, you don't necessarily need the shortcuts of the drugs to experience states those are profound, mind-altering, you could say shortcuts. Whereas, again, if you take 1 hit or 2 hits of DMT, it doesn't have to be a full breakthrough. I don't know. I just see a lot of similarities, and everyone has their own experiences. Some people have nothing really come from it, apparently. So it really is what you yourself put into things. But same with this sort of, these books and all that. And how you interpret it and apply it. And so I don't know, it may not be the best idea to link the two, but for me, that's how I arrived at all this. Curiosity about consciousness and, practices, etc. So I put the title ABA, or ABA, is an obvious allusion to the 2 forces, or double wand of the magician. Twain his forces, 4 his weapons. This book is the storehouse of magical knowledge which Crowley sought to compose, to preserve for future generations, as well as add onto the ancient wisdom tradition, which had until he synthesized it remained dispersed. Note that Book 4 is 444. The number of the 11-fold precept, do what thou wilt, shall be the whole of the law, in simple gematria. This is the number of the Book of Shadows, also traditionally said to keep the magical knowledge of generations. So pretty much the primeval grimoire, or the primal grimoire. Since we know magic is light and light is power, the Sanskrit word for power or strength is known as the bala, or bala, the energy of the light. And again, lightning rod, there's a lot to do with lightning, essentially, or the thunderbolt with 444, also known as the Baal, i.e. the Lord. This is the force that constitutes the rainbow body. Again, the indestructible way, all these teachings of Padmasambhava, etc., or astral light body. So again, that's what the robe chapter in Magic is all about. So the importance of the 3 and the 4 is particularly related to the unfolding interplay of the supernal triad and 4 elements, and they combine in the 7 rays of light. 7 cubed, or 7 times 7 times 7, is 343, the magical ray which, being fractal, contains within the 7 virtues, 7 keys, and 7 evils, to which he may align, unlock, and transcend. 343 is the number of Liber 343, an account of Amrita, the elixir of life. The Atman, 101, or self, also the number of Atlas, see Liber 51, which constantly refracts indefinitely to create the Vajradhatu light palace, the eternal palace, which is a world of light, seen only by those who can see beyond the physical substrate of matter. It's also the Lapsit Exilis, or the fallen, exiled stone, which symbolizes the lost and forbidden or censored wisdom of this light source within, the secret light body. All true teachers will say not to look here nor there, but to find the keys within. Consider this in the upcoming lessons on meditation. And so again, I really only covered 444 here. 343 and 101, which 343 is also, and God said in Hebrew, or associating light with creation. Again, 101 is so many different things. It's Ayodhya. Having slowly learned more about Sanskrit and other languages in the East, there's a lot more that this can be looked at through, like, again, the Bala, or the Aditi, is 444 as well, which is also like elemental energy. And Shinto, which is all about animism and elementalism. So I don't know, there's a lot of different studies and ways to look at things, but book 4 is a really good introduction. And again, he goes into the interpreting fairy tales and legends with the Kabbalah, but you can end up going further and interpreting past events and people, personages, and their sort of dramas, as well as present things, because it's all within a sort of overlapping, superimposed framework, and things tend to repeat themselves for whatever reason, and not repeat 100%, but patterns repeat. And I don't know, this whole reading of Prometheus, or what is it? Not Prometheus, Persephone, and The Ancient Secret, In Search of the Holy Grail. They're obviously completely different books with somewhat different outlooks and subjects, but I see them as very related in too many ways to count. Like, they both talk about this idea of the globe or the sphere, especially in its relation to what you could call the soul, or the self outside of the locality of the present moment, the globe of totality, you could say. Just the implications of that and how how it plays out symbolically, crystals, diamonds, dewdrops, etc. I don't know, so I see this symbolism as very related. I just didn't really go too deep into it. But yeah, the Kabbalah of 9 Chambers, as I'm reading these 2 books, I'm seeing a lot of keys, essentially, that I found within them. And again, you could think that you've exhausted all the avenues and resources and whatnot, but there's always more. I don't know, it's perplexing even to me how after this long I still am finding more and more and more. So yeah, I don't know, I could say a lot about book 4, and I pretty much have, but since the next few videos are going to be long, I might as well keep this short. Alright, I'm going to read chapter 2 from A Study of Two Worlds, or Persephone, and it's the section called The Two Worlds. The picture of 2 worlds at war is an ever-present theme in No Orchids. On the one hand, there is the upper world of law and order, of virtue and rectitude, ruled by John Blandish and defended by his minions, the detective Fenner and the police. On the other, the underworld of crime, vice and license, ruled by Ma and her gangsters. These two worlds hate one another with an implacable hatred, and whenever they are brought into contact there is bloodshed. The means of bringing them into contact is Miss Blandish, for each acquires a claim on her, and it is about her person that the conflict rages. This situation, of course, is the essence of every thriller, the excitement and tension of which is maintained by this picture of conflict between two opposing factions for the possession of some object of great value. The antagonists are commonly represented nowadays as the police and the criminal gang, or our own secret service, and that of another country. In Treasure Island it was Squire Livesy's men and the pirates, but the pattern is already to be found in the Book of Job, in which the antagonists appear as God and Satan. That is the fundamental formula. The conflict is between constituted authority and the established order on the one hand, and the rebellious powers of the dispossessed on the other. It is necessary for the reader to be persuaded to take sides, and generally the choice falls on the conventional side of constituted authority. Occasionally, on the other hand, it is for the deserving rebel, the Robin Hood type, but that, for the moment, we may ignore. In No Orchids, we are on the side of authority, for although the powers of law and order and of Blandish's rectitude are anything but attractively portrayed, their antagonists are seen in an even worse light. And Fenner, the detective, ruthless and brutal though he is, resembles the traditional hero more closely than does any other character. The orientation thus revealed is important in the sequel. If we go back to Job, we find that the object of value around which the conflict rages is the soul of man. In modern times it has assumed a more concrete form, being seen as an object of pecuniary value, such as a jewel, or something of critical importance, such as secret plans. In the fairy tales and legends, we also find the idea of the treasure of gold and jewels, or simply of the kingdom. The latter form is, of course, irreconcilable with a modern context, for kingdoms today do not pass so easily from hand to hand. One of the last exploitations of this particular image is to be found in the famous 19th century thriller, The Prisoner of Zenda. Now, G.F. Orwell, in an interesting article devoted to No Orchids, interprets the whole story as the struggle for power. It is evident from his last book, 1984, which will be the subject of later consideration, that towards the end of his life he was obsessed with this Nietzschean idea, in the light of which he interprets modern political trends. Nietzsche's ideas also will be the subject of discussion in a later volume, but I may anticipate at this point by saying that the form in which that misguided philosopher presents his doctrine of the universal struggle for power is an oversimplification and a distortion of the truth. Power is a difficult and variable concept which cannot be utilized in a philosophical context without further definition. If this is nevertheless done as Nietzsche did it, the consequence is that suggestions of coercion and tyranny are apt to be unconsciously embodied in propositions in which they may be completely irrelevant. Nevertheless, Orwell's thesis contains a germ of truth, for the treasure, the object of contention between the rival forces, does include power, in the sense of the capacity to guide and to act, among its attributes. The form in which the treasure is seen substantiate this. The possession of the kingdom represents the ability to utilize its resources. That of the treasure of jewels or gold symbolizes the capacity to influence and act conferred by riches. That of the secret plans, the ability to succeed in some venture. All these forms are summed up in the basic image of the soul, which in this context means the final ability of the individual to decide and to act. This is the object of contention between the rival powers of God and Satan in the story of Job, for the dramatic tension in the legend hinges on the choice with which the protagonist is faced between the two tendencies which are striving for his allegiance. But in the event, Job, and Faust after him, discovers a third possibility. He contrives to retain his freedom of choice for himself, for he refuses either to be intimidated by the demonstrations of Yahweh's might, or to be beguiled by the blandishments of Satan, as expressed through the mouths of his friends and his wife. Curse God and die. Thereby he wins a moral victory over both contestants and, in effect, compels Yahweh to improve himself. This theme is brilliantly elaborated in Jung's Antwort auf Hiob, or answer to Job. The theme of the contest for the treasure, therefore, does not simply consist in the straight fight between the two opposing forces for the possession of power, such as Marx sees the struggle for the possession of the means of production, as it must seem to do for so long as the treasure is represented as an inanimate object without volition of its own. It consists, on the contrary, of the struggle to obtain the allegiance of a free agent. The treasure, in the last resort, is the power of free decision, potentially possessed by every conscious individuality. But for so long as the individual is subject to unconscious impulses, that freedom is only potential, not actual, for we cannot reject a tendency of which we are not aware. While this is the case, the individual is not really free. He is truly the passive and helpless object of the rivalry of forces over which he has no control, no more than the jewel or the secret plans which can be stolen, taken by force, or sold. The treasure, the power of free decision, is not in his possession. In the language of psychology, he is subject to compulsions because the source of his will is inaccessible to him. It is imprisoned in his unconscious mind. A psychotherapist once said of a patient in this condition, "The patient says that she cannot. The nurse says that she will not. The truth is that she cannot will." The condition is not confined to those under medical care. The situation constitutes one of the principal themes of this study, and its further elaboration must be left until later. The conclusion implicit in it is that each of us must undertake the quest of the treasure for himself, if he is not to remain the helpless puppet of blind forces. To do so, it is necessary to adventure in the field of battle of the contending forces of opposites, and to expose ourselves to all the pains and dangers which that entails. The nature of the treasure is not so much to be seen in the element of power which belongs to it, as in its supreme value. Value, in the last resort, derives from need, a fact which is expressed in the economic theory of marginal values. The attainment of the treasure is in many cases the only way of spiritual survival, and therefore, for those who have reached this precarious position of the mind, and they are often the most gifted, the creative personalities, it is the most valuable of all things. The supreme value, moreover, is not confined to the individual, for the problems with which he has to deal are those of the universal part of the mind, or the collective unconscious. If he succeeds in solving them for himself, he has contributed towards the collective solution by the whole society of which he forms a part. The manner in which he makes that contribution consists in the production of a creative work or in the setting up of a creative example in the form of his own life and performance. The realization of the possibility of this way of salvation is preeminently revealed in the appearance of the treasure in human form, for that implies that it is seen as something living, with its own volition and intelligence, capable of taking a hand in its own destiny. This development is presented in striking form in No Orchids, in the substitution of Miss Blandish herself for her diamonds. I think that there can be little doubt that this author sat down to write his thriller without the slightest idea of how it was going to develop, or if he had a complete plot in mind, that he soon abandoned it and allowed his character to follow their own propensities. There are several indications of this which will be discussed in their place. For the moment, I wish merely to draw attention to the effect produced by the appearance of Miss Blandish herself. I have suggested that Faulkner's Sanctuary probably provided the inspiration for No Orchids, and some of the more detailed parallels between the two works will be discussed later. The derivation appears in two quite separate spheres. The more important is the symbolical, seen in the basic plot of No Orchids, and in the rendering of the principal characters, but a second is to be found in the literary manner adopted in its earlier chapters. We may consider the latter first. Sanctuary is scrupulously realistic in its background. The author's intention, which he has very convincingly carried out, is to present an objective picture of a world which actually existed. How true it is, I am unable to say, but the effect is impressive in the same way as, for instance, the earlier part of Flaubert's Madame Bovary is impressive. The reader feels that this is no fabulous world inhabited by synthetic or idealized personages, but a picture of real life, that is to say, of ordinary people with ordinary self-contradictory characters, following their humdrum destinies in a world of limited means, small pleasures, and petty aspirations. Madame Bovary herself later runs away with the story, the latter part of which develops into a wild fantasy, impressive in quite a different way. Faulkner, however, with an iron self-discipline which Flaubert lacked, keeps both feet firmly on the ground to the bitter end. Nothing is allowed to happen simply as one might wish it to happen. No character is allowed to outgrow the human limitations allotted to him at the outset. No liberties are taken with the intractable, incoherent, unpoetic nature of the outer world. Fantasy, in fact, is studiously and consistently disguised in the garb of a meticulous and impartial psychological and sociological study. It is a fair conjecture that the author of No Orchids set out to write his own book in the same strain. Gamesters were to be the mean, shoddy creatures, which most of them really are. We are told in the opening scene of the shabby suits and cracked shoes which they wear, and they were to frequent the kind of cheap, prosaic places which they really do frequent. The memorable opening scene of the book is set in no luxurious nightclub, nor yet in a sinister den of vice, but in Minnie's hash house, an ordinary shabby little eating place. Then a true-to-life, down-at-heel crook appears and forms the unromantic but plausible plan of holding up Miss Blandish in order to steal the diamonds, which she will be wearing for her birthday party. But, as we shall see later, the symbolic elements, even in this opening scene, are already bursting out of the realistic frame, and the author has to take drastic steps to reduce them to order. Having done so, he continues with his project, but his resolve is short-lived. It collapses in the moment when Miss Blandish appears on the scene. She is a vision of purity and beauty, a personification in herself of all that is desirable. The archetypal image of the treasure is immediately projected on to her figure, and henceforth she herself is the priceless object around which the conflict rages. The shabby little gangsters are no longer good enough. The brighter the light, the blacker the shadow, and the magic of Miss Blandish calls up from the shadows the somber powers of the Grissom mob. Out of the night emerges Slim, the killer, with his knife, his polished shoes and his yellow eyes. Behind him follows the awful figure of Ma, the devil's grandmother, attended by all the minor fallen angels. The tawdry glitter of the diamonds fades before the glory of Miss Blandish, and no more is heard of them until Slim casually returns them to his love. It would be impossible to devise an apter way of indicating that she herself has usurped their position as the object of contention. From the strictly rational point of view, there is no purpose in this change from the diamonds to Miss Blandish as the lost treasure which must be regained, nor in the double kidnapping, first by the original gang and then by the Grissom mob. The latter point is adroitly utilized later in providing a false trail for the police, but it is improbable that it was deliberately devised for the purpose. If the author at the outset had visualized Miss Blandish's falling into the hands of Slim, the obvious sequence would have been to have him see her by chance fall in love with her beauty and kidnap her for the reason. Such a plot would have proved no less effective than the one he eventually devised. But in view of what he actually wrote, it is a reasonable conjecture that he set out to write a story somewhat in the realistic vein of Sanctuary, but of course with an entirely original plot. When Miss Blandish appeared, however, both these resolutions collapsed. In the first place, the symbolism of Sanctuary forced itself on him, and he was compelled to allow Miss Blandish to follow her true inner world destiny, which was that of Persephone as presented in Sanctuary. In the second place, the short-lived vein of realism was happily abandoned, for Miss Blandish, like Emma Bovary, ran away with the story, soaring with it to realms of unbridled fantasy. The Grissom mob are no longer possible, and from the conscientious dinginess of Minnie's hash home and Dan's hideout, we are transported into a setting of improbable luxury, so vague that the writer has not even troubled to think out who does the housework. In Sanctuary, such details are never overlooked. I have spoken of Miss Blandish's running away with the story. This must not be understood as a figure of speech, implying merely that the writer became so preoccupied with this character that he overlooked other matters. It means far more than that. Miss Blandish, or Persephone, is an archetypal image, and as such, she has a will of her own. She not only represents, but is, a definite pattern of the mind, with its own attributes and its own mode of behavior, and she will always insist on following her true nature and her inherent destiny. If attempts are made to thwart her in this, she will find means of circumventing them. We shall find examples of this in the further course of this study. This autonomous nature of the archetypes revealed by their self-willed behavior, when they appear in fantasy, is a cardinal point in my thesis. It will be amply substantiated by further examples, but for the present I can do no better than quote Jung on the subject. These entities, he writes in Antwort auf Hiob, or Answer to Job, are the archetypes of the collective unconscious, which are the cause of complex representations such as mythological themes. Representations of this type are not invented, but appear to the inner awareness, for instance in dreams as ready-made images. They are spontaneous phenomena which are independent of the will, and it is therefore justifiable to attribute a certain degree of autonomy to them. Therefore, they are not only to be regarded as objects, but as subjects with their own laws. It is, of course, possible to describe them from the viewpoint of consciousness as objects, and to explain them up to a point, just as it is possible to describe and explain a living person. In this case, of course, their autonomy must be disregarded. But if the latter is taken into consideration, they must unavoidably be treated as subjects. That is to say, that spontaneity and purposefulness, or a kind of consciousness and freedom of will, must be admitted in them. One observes their behavior and takes account of their pronouncements. This dual viewpoint, which is necessary to adopt in face of every relatively independent organism, produces, of course, a dual result. On the one hand, an account of what I do to the object, on the other, of what that object does, and on occasion of what it does to me. This characteristic autonomous behavior of the archetypal figures is attested by many writers of fiction. The following passage, chosen at random, will serve to illustrate the familiar pattern. Pierre Benoit in L'Île Verte is describing his feelings when about to start a novel. I was going to be master of time and space, my own master, master of everything, except of the ghosts which I was about to create. However rigorous the plan to which I proposed to coerce them, I knew well that they would not follow it, that hardly would they have issued from within me, then they would escape me, that they would live their own lives in which I should count for little, that they would compel me to share all their passions, to weep, to suffer, and to love with them. 2 points in this passage deserve particular notice. First, the reference to the writer's mastery of time and space, for as we shall see later, this freedom is characteristic of the inner world, in contrast to the outer, which is essentially the pattern of what is bound by them. Secondly, the assertion that the writer is compelled to share the emotions of his creations. He must do so because they are no mere allegories or artifacts, but living symbols which do not only represent, but actually are factors working in his mind. To this point we shall return shortly. The barrier. Up to this point we have considered the theme of two worlds only in the form revealed in the rival factions which we found contending for the treasure. This image, however, is a basic element of the story, as it is of many stories, and we may now turn to other forms in which it appears. A point which strikes the attention of the reader, who is alert for symbolical features, is the frequency with which the telephone appears in the book. The telephone is, of course, an essential concomitant of modern life, but then so are the radio and the airplane, and neither of these plays any part in the story. Telephoning, on the other hand, has a peculiar importance. The symbolical significance of telephoning is that it is a communication with somebody who is somewhere else, present but not here. The awareness of such unseen presences has always played a part in fantasies, myths, and legends. In old times, people would hear voices. There's a special word in Arabic, hatefa, meaning the voice of an unseen speaker. Or, in a more realistic type of story, the device of the smuggled letter was employed. Instances of this latter device will be met with hereafter. But the invention of the telephone, which so strikingly produces the voice of the unseen speaker, has provided the intuitive faculty, to which its symbolical significance is at once apparent, with a new and far more telling image. Evidence of the use to which intuitive fantasy puts even such modern inventions may be found in the delusions of the insane. The up-to-date paranoiac no longer believes that he is being persecuted with the evil eye, or by having pins stuck into his waxen effigy. He maintains that his oppressors make use of radar waves. To the unconscious, the new magic is no different from the old, for it is concerned only with its symbolical aspect. I may add that my own unconscious consistently makes use of images derived from motoring. The use of the symbol of the telephone, which is made in no orchids, is striking. Several of the major characters make their first appearances, so to speak, at the other end of the telephone. We hear their disembodied voices before we meet them in the flesh. These include both John Blandish and Ma Grissom. Anna, whom we shall meet later, has to be rung up no less than 3 times before she makes up her mind to a definite entrance. Then she is first seen in a telephone box. Now, when an author wishes to introduce new characters, there is nothing to prevent his simply causing them to walk onto the scene, or if that should prove inconvenient, he may transport us into their presence. The fact that this author so consistently introduces his characters by telephone suggests that he is strongly aware of us somewhere else. It expresses his feeling that these figures are always present, in the background, out of sight. They may not be here, present to our consciousness, but they are always there, liable to take a hand in the course of events. The same use of the symbol of telephoning is strongly marked in Kafka's Trial, which will be considered in a later volume of this series. Another significant symbolical feature is the appearance in the early morning of people who have been driving all night. This occurs in the opening scene, in which the first gangster, Bailey, is dropped into Minnie's hash house to get his breakfast after an all-night drive, and it is repeated on several occasions later in the story. Constantly we find the cars from the night, dust-stained with their pale, tired occupants, appearing in the early morning. When we wake up, they are there. Once again, we have the inference of that somewhere else, out of which the motorists make their sudden appearance. And now we have a clue concerning its nature. It has to do with the dark world of sleep, of dreams, and of the unconscious. In the ancient myths, the sun thus appears in his chariot or boat after his long night journey through the underworld. It is the image of the rebirth of consciousness after sleep. It may be worth mentioning that in the act of awaking, I find myself frequently dream of arriving at the end of a journey, generally by sea, whereas when falling asleep I have visions of departure. The point in the present context is that one of the contents of that somewhere else has merged into the light of consciousness, of here, just as dreams occurring just before we wake are retained in the conscious memory. Lastly, we find the barrier. We meet with it on 4 distinct occasions, and 3 of them under precisely that name, barrier. In the office of Fenner, the detective, there is a strong wooden barrier, and behind it sits Paula, his secretary, a glamorous blonde. Then at the Paradise Club, the headquarters of the Grissom gang, there is a steel barrier, vaguely identified with the cloakroom, and behind it sits Maisie, the check girl, a glamorous blonde. Again, there is a barrier behind which sit the professional dancing partners at another nightclub. Fenner strides past it, exchanging a wisecrack with the girl who sits there. We are told that she is a blonde, but since she is a hostess at a glamorous nightclub, we may assume that she is glamorous too. Finally, there is the counter at Minnie's hash house. This is the first appearance of the barrier in the important opening scene of the book. And although it is not given precisely that name, we can identify it by the presence behind it of the waitress, another glamorous blonde. To her we shall return shortly. For the moment, we may concentrate on the barrier itself. The fourfold repetition of this image of the barrier and the blonde is too much for coincidence, and we may conclude that it has some important significance. A barrier is something which separates. It excludes, but it also contains, and its essential meaning is that the objects on the other side of it are prevented from coming into contact. Here then we have another rendering of the all-pervading theme of dichotomy, of the existence of 2 distinct worlds, which may be in communication with one another but are essentially separate. We have already noted one factor which separates them, and that is the conflict between the 2 factions represented by John Blandish and Maud Grissom, but there may be others. This barrier, however, is always visualized as having a door through which it is possible to pass, even the counter in the hash house being evidently equipped with the usual flap or gate, for the waitress presently emerges from behind it to serve the customers and clear the tables. The particular part of the barrier which is brought to our notice, in fact, is the point where there is a gate through it, and it is at this point that we always find the glamorous blonde. She is the guardian of the threshold, a function which we shall find confirmed in other works. In order to form some idea of the nature of the 2 worlds thus separated, we may turn to the memorable opening scene in Minnie's hash house. It is an impressive passage according to any literary standards, and that is probably due to 2 factors. In the first place, it is intensely and vividly visualized, and in the second, it is full of symbolical elements. To some of these we have already referred, and others will appear in due course. It is the morning of an intensely hot day, and in spite of the early hour, the atmosphere is already drained and exhausted. The dinginess of the scene and the shabbiness of the characters who first appear is conveyed with great skill, and the feeling tone is grey and unhappy. For Bailey, the gangster, is tired after his all-night drive and depressed, since business is not going well. The dingy, crude, unsatisfactory, exhausting aspect of life is presented with harsh insistence. Realism. I have already referred to this grey hopelessness of tone which pervades Sanctuary, and much of No Orchids as well, although nowhere more strikingly than in this opening scene, and suggested that it is an integral part of the theme of the 2 stories. To some extent it is associated with the realist attitude, the essence of which is its insistence that life as it is differs very much from life as it appears in fantasy. It is more complicated, less coherent, more limited, and circumscribed by accidentals. It is generally less intensely tragic, but at the same time far less pleasurable. The growth of the realist movement in the literature of the 19th century represents an important differentiation of consciousness, which goes hand in hand with the growth of the scientific mentality. Nowadays, we can no longer slip unconcerned through the barrier which divides fact from fancy, as the medieval romancer could. The storyteller must either be a realist or a declared writer of fables, allegories, or fantasies. Our awareness of the separate existence of two worlds, an outer world of fact and an inner world of fantasy, has grown far more acute, and we have to face the problem of reconciling the two. The necessity of this reconciliation will be one of our principal themes in this enquiry. It is not to be achieved by the prevalent contemporary tendency to accord the property of reality solely to the outer world, dismissing the inner as no more than ideas or fancies or wishful thinking or escapism or psychology. This is what Jung describes as the nothing but or no more than, nichts wie, attitude, and it is a very dangerous one, for the inner world is intensely real, and if we attempt to deny its reality, we shall involve ourselves in troubles no less disastrous than we should if we attempted to deny the reality of facts. Faulkner, we saw, maintained this realistic attitude consistently throughout his book, but Chase, to whom it was clearly less congenial, abandoned it early. He was, no doubt, inspired to attempt it by Sanctuary, or by other works in the same vein, but that was no mere slavish imitation. He must, on the contrary, have been struck and impressed by the atmosphere it creates, or, in other words, he reacted to its inner message. This fact is substantiated by the elements of pessimism and hopelessness which pervades the story, even when the outer form of realism has been abandoned. The enlargement of his free fantasy allows him to indulge in far more uninhibited horrors, and more of a certain cynical lightheartedness than Faulkner even permits himself, yet the awareness of the dreary unsatisfactoriness of life in this world always remains in the background. The final abandonment of the limitations of realism accompanies the appearance of Miss Blandish, yet we may already discern the first impulses towards it in the opening scene. It comes with the waitress, who is described as follows. She had worked on herself until, from a distance, she looked as good as any movie star, but when you got near, she wasn't so hot. She patted her tight yellow curls and stretched. Bailey thought she was wearing a false front. The whole episode, as I have said, is intensely and vividly visualized, and here the visual image is that of a ravishing blonde proffering a well-developed bosom across the counter. But the realist intention will not permit of such a vision of glamour in the dingy surroundings of the hash house. So the author hastily assures us that her charms are counterfeit. It is a neat evasion, but as we shall see, quite useless, for the blonde is not so easily dismissed. She will shortly reappear, completely with bosom, and this time no doubts will be cast on its authenticity. The background obviously demands a slattern, ruthlessly depicted, and as such Faulkner would have presented her. This sudden eruption of an otherworld fantasy figure into the carefully controlled picture of this world dreariness reveals the nature of the impulsion which led to the writing of the story. It is to be a venture into the world beyond the barrier, reached through the gate which the blonde guards, and with which she is identical. As we shall see later, it is she who has the power of admitting to her charmed world those who find favor with her. Admission is only to be gained with her consent, and by those who come to her alone. Any attempt to storm the barrier by force can only be successful at the expense of bloodshed, and even if it succeeds, it is fruitless. The blonde is of an amorous disposition. That is the only reason why it is possible to gain admission. But this feminine frailty entails a desire to detain her lovers in dalliance with her at the gate, and if they succumb to her charms, they will progress no further into the world she guards. It is therefore necessary, if we wish to penetrate more deeply into the other world, to repel her advances as courteously as possible, as we saw Fenner doing at the nightclub, and press on into the recesses beyond. Nevertheless, the blonde remains the embodiment of that whole inaccessible world, as we see it from this world. She is the first adventure which we meet on the other side of the barrier, and the quest of the treasure which lies beyond is, in the last resort, no more than the quest of the undisclosed part of her nature. This important aspect of her image will concern us at some length in later chapters. The other side. The other world is not simply the world of pipe dreams and escapism, of personal fantasies, of self-glorification and impossible delights, indulged in as a compensation for the unsatisfactory nature of life in this world. Such things may, of course, enter into its composition, but it is far more than that. It is hard to indicate its nature to those who have little or no acquaintance with it, but in some respects to enter it is like going to a play. With a little practice, the observer is able to watch the happenings which occur there without guiding or influencing them. They go forward autonomously according to their own laws. They are, of course, often fragmentary and do not make sense, and in such a case it is a mistake to attempt to force coherence or sense into them by conscious standards. If the observer is utilizing his fantasy for the purpose of writing a story or a play, he will, of course, be compelled to do so. But unless he has developed the faculty of going along with his fantasies and discerning their underlying tendencies sufficiently to avoid distorting their true nature, he will get into difficulties. This is because, although he is not composing or making his fantasies, he cannot avoid participating in their content, and that content has an emotional component. The fantasies have a purpose, for they are archetypal processes brought into play by the necessity of restoring equilibrium to the mind. If that purpose is misunderstood and thwarted by conscious interference, the images react exactly as though they were human beings similarly provoked. They become hostile and visit their frustration on the subject in the form of unpleasant emotional attacks. Feelings of anxiety and horror, shame and depression, amounting to despair, are the consequence. These conditions, if they become habitual, constitute a very real danger to the physical no less than to mental health. They are among the risks entailed by frequentation of the inner world, and they constitute the reason why preoccupation with it is commonly stigmatized as unwholesome, dangerous, or even sinful. Such an attitude, however, can do nothing but harm, for it is impossible to evade the claims and the problems of the inner life, and any misguided attempt to do so may lead, as we shall see, to really serious consequences involving others besides the immediate victim. This, then, is the archetypal world, the inner world of the universal mind or collective unconscious. Those whose conscious minds have come into contact with it have often partaken of nourishment in the world of shadows, are inescapably bound to face and work out its problems, in their minds and in their lives, to the bitter end. Others may safely resign themselves to the guidance of the mores of a sound community. This may sound a hard fate, and in some ways it is one, but the inner world offers great rewards as well as penalties. Apart from subjective joys, no less than those which the outer world has to offer, there is the supreme gift of creativeness, which brings spiritual life and the power of self-renewal from the inner to the outer world. Gustav Meyrink, whom we shall discuss later, called this world, with its richness of manifold forms, its delights and horrors, the other side, derived from the title of Alfred Kubin's fantasy, Die andere Seite. This important book, which was a source of inspiration to both Meyrink and Kafka, will concern us in a later volume. A designation of which I shall make use from time to time because of its aptness and power of suggesting the true nature of a source of spiritual life and sphere of existence, which is in effect the other side of our human nature, the hidden side normally concealed by the obtrusiveness of personal consciousness. Creative personalities develop a familiarity with the other side at an early age, and throughout their lives they are oppressed by a sense of its segregation from this world, and filled with a nostalgic longing to live exclusively in it. But the hard and ineluctable law of the barrier, and of the existence of two separate worlds which it implies, denies the possibility of amalgamating these two incompatible modes of experience. Each has to be approached and dealt with separately, according to its own nature, and it is not until we have learnt to understand the separate, distinct, and often contrasting laws which govern these two natures that we can set about the task of reconciling the two worlds between which we live, like Persephone, are compelled to share our lives. When this has been accomplished, and not before, it may be possible to build up a harmonious manner of existence in which its due importance is allotted to each world, and the two are brought together in a kind of mating, which produces a perpetual creative self-renewal. But before we can bring about the union, it is necessary first to carry out the separation. We must, in fact, concentrate on the distinctions and the contrasts between the two worlds. This pattern of development is embodied in the basic principle of mystical alchemy, according to which it is necessary first to separate out the two opposing elements inherent in the mysterious materia prima, in order then to bring them together in fruitful union. See Herbert Silberer, Problème der Mystique ou Erreur symbolique, English translation by Jeff Jalif, Problems of Mysticism and its Symbolism, and Jung, Psychologie ou Alchemy, or Psychology and Alchemy, English translation number 12 in the Collected Works. With this supreme symbolical image we shall be concerned throughout this investigation. The initial concentrations on the separateness and incompatibility of the two worlds is apt to produce in creative personalities a feeling of disgust and repugnance for this world, which is seen as a true vale of tears, in which we are imprisoned for the greater part of our lives. The other side is the source of all spiritual life and spiritual values, and the goods of this world appear, by contrast, transient and cheap. Its environment is impoverished and lifeless. In a later volume we shall find this contrast superbly expressed by Keats in one of the masterpieces of poetry, and later again by Emily Bronte in her works, Her Life and Her Death. In No Orchids we have the same theme presented in an unconventional and unexpected form. This disreputable thriller is not, perhaps, a masterpiece of literature, but it is profoundly experienced and fundamentally true. Hadley Chase, then, struck and impressed by the rendering in Sanctuary of feelings which he shared about the miseries and deprivations of life in this world, set out to give his own rendering of it, and produced the opening scene of No Orchids. But this awareness of the shortcomings of one world implies a corresponding awareness of the superiorities of the other. Setting out to portray the wretchedness of life as it is, he necessarily had at the back of his mind a vision of life as it might be, as it ought to be. The same, of course, applied to Faulkner and to Flaubert when they set out to write Sanctuary and Madame Bovary, respectively. Faulkner, with an astonishing continuity of conscious purposefulness, succeeded in restraining and concealing his imminent vision of beauty and delight throughout. Flaubert, less self-disciplined, allowed his shallow petite bourgeois to transform herself into a creature of wild and extravagant passions, whose figure offers occasional glimpses of a vision of unearthly and elemental beauty. Chase succumbs early to this vision in the purse of Miss Blandish, but even she, as we have seen, has a precursor in the form of the hash house waitress, whose charms are so hastily disowned. The reason for this hurried dismissal was that the author was already all too familiar with her, as so many men are, and knew that she represents the first hazard which is met after passing the barrier. To succumb to dalliance with her precludes the further prosecution of the quest of the treasure. And that is not all, for, as we shall see, it has its own disastrous consequences as well. This time he is determined not to allow himself to be detained at the threshold, but to penetrate deeply into the mysterious world of the other side, and to discover what is going on there. Accordingly, he dismisses the waitress as unworthy of attention, and resolutely pursues the vision of the treasure, which he still sees as a diamond necklace. But when he brings it to consciousness, he discovers that it is not the diamonds which he seeks, but their wearer. She is only the blonde again, but she is more than the waitress, for something has been added to her, and into the nature of that something we have now to inquire. I have already said that the quest of the treasure is in the last resort nothing else than the quest for the complete nature of the blonde, and here we find confirmation of the fact. The inhabitants of the other side. The determination to penetrate more deeply than hitherto beyond the barrier is indicated by two symbolical elements in the opening scene. The first is the early hour. It is the beginning of a new day, of a new enterprise. Bailey has been driving all night, and now he appears in the light of morning, whereupon the plan for securing the diamonds is immediately formed. In other words, an unconscious content which has been working its way out of the darkness now appears in the light of consciousness, and a fresh resolution is reached. The second point is the heat. It is the Indian tapas, or creative effort, which is thus represented, or the alchemistical stage of cooking, which activates the process of transmutation. This symbolism of heat is often found in dreams. Hereupon the blonde appears, but her charms are dismissed as counterfeit, and Bailey, accordingly, after a little polite flirtation with her, presses forward with the business in hand and leads us to the diamonds. The enterprise has been successful. A penetration has been effected into the world beyond the barrier, and the first result is that a number of characters from Sanctuary, who had evidently taken up their abode on the other side, come tumbling out. Most of them have been so transmuted by their residence in the unconscious that they are unrecognizable at first glance. Only one, the father, remains virtually unchanged. To start with, there is the girl who is ravished, Miss Blandish herself. She is changed from the shallow, inherently vicious high school student, so subtly portrayed by Faulkner, into something strangely colorless, sometimes pathetic, and occasionally raised to a certain sublimity by her sufferings, although Chase attempts to follow his model, which must have become conscious at some time during the development of the story, by suggesting the demoralization which ought to result from her adventures. He fails to convince even himself. Miss Blandish enjoys so much of his respect that he does not even give her a first name. He refers to her thus formally right to the bitter end. She remains strangely innocent and unspoiled throughout, a suffering, bewildered wraith in the underground, and she only comes to life twice, once in the strange interlude in which she refuses to be taken from Slim, and again in her tragic end. On both of these occasions she shows courage and spirit, quite unlike the mean depravity of her original. She is no character study, but a true heroine, in fact, Persephone. It is the same with Slim. He enters with a blare of brass, Satan incarnate. He immediately carries out 2 murders, one of them by stabbing a helpless man in the abdomen and staying to watch the lengthy process of his demise. At this point, the author spares himself no pains to build up this character into a monstrosity of horror. Then Slim falls into love with Miss Blandish, and that is to be an added horror, for she, of course, could not possibly reciprocate his loathsome passion. But that is the author's mistake, for Slim and Miss Blandish suddenly take matters into their own hands. They insist on their love affair, and when the author makes tentative efforts to break it up, it is Miss Blandish who objects. Now, by degrees, Slim becomes less loathsome. We see him more in the light of the fighter, who likes a tough spot, than that of the sadistic pervert. Then we notice that whereas Miss Blandish habitually lives upstairs, Slim is continually climbing downstairs. This activity of his is described too often, and with too much circumstance to be a mere coincidence. Freud, as everybody knows, has laid it down that climbing stairs symbolizes copulation, and that may well be the case, sometimes. But it is obvious that the basic meaning of climbing stairs is that of raising oneself to a higher level, and that is what Slim is attempting to do, striving upwards out of the underworld to Miss Blandish's level. This exertion takes its toll of him, and as the story progresses, we hear more and more of how tired he is. Clearly, the author's attitude towards him has changed. He is still ferocious, but since he has defied his terrible mother for Miss Blandish's sake, he is no longer contemptible. And when at last his creator has to kill him off, he is a little sorry for him. The thin white face, upturned, looked pathetically defenseless. Slim had slipped into the role of hero. Nothing but the original impotence and the joy in killing remain of Faulkner's strange, detached, idiosyncratic Popeye. Yet, in parentheses, it is interesting to note that two of Popeye's idiosyncrasies, his invariable black suits and his incessant cigarette smoking, are spread over three characters in the sequel to No Orchids, The Flesh of the Orchid, to which I shall refer later. The father has changed from a southern gentleman into a Yankee industrialist, but otherwise there is no difference. In both books he stands for unyielding authority and a harsh, unbending insistence on what he pleases to regard as his honor. He represents the implacable arbiter of rectitude who visits the sins of the fathers on the children. It is in Ma Grissom that the most astounding transmutation is revealed, for it is only in her repellent but awe-inspiring physical appearance that she is identifiable with Faulkner's almost engaging whorehouse madam, with her ladylike tea parties and her sighs for her deceased husband. But Ma is a far less ambiguous figure. She is the root of all evil. It is her remorseless cruelty, her scheming viciousness, which provides the mainspring for all the discreditable activities of the underworld. These characters now begin to act the story which has been staged in the opening chapters. They are living figures which are truly and literally working out their destinies in the mind of a writer, and in the many other minds besides. It is his virtue that he has recorded their doings with intuitive honesty, and has thus foreshadowed a solution to a situation of deadlock which affects our whole civilization. I have already given several instances of their autonomy, of the manner in which they pursue their own courses with scant respect for the intentions of the author. In the first place, there was the substitution of Miss Blandish for the diamonds. Then there is the gradual assumption by Slim and Miss Blandish of the roles of hero and heroine, and Miss Blandish's inexplicable refusal to be rescued. We shall find another example in the story of the transformations of the glamorous blonde, which it will be convenient to consider next. The Ancient Secret in Search of the Holy Grail, Chapter 3. Odin's Sword and the Brand Excalibur. With all our knowledge of modern science, as far as we know, there is nothing of a material nature which penetrates to our world from outer space, except light rays and perhaps cosmic rays. How the waves of light traverse the apparently empty void to reach our atmosphere is still one of the great mysteries which science has not yet explained. It is not surprising, therefore, that all religions, including our own Christian faith, should have seen in light the symbol of that invisible something which we trust and pray reaches out to us from the realms of the Spirit. The sacred fire was the symbol of the visible arrival of this divine spirit, and therefore it was always associated with the divine or priest king of early times, because it explained to the eye how his supposed incarnation from the sun god was effected. Just as light descended from heaven to kindle a flame, so it was thought did the sun god's spirit descend to enter the body of the king. For this reason, the kindling of fire from the sun was very much the king's business, and the torch which he kindled was the symbol of his divinity. From it, in turn, he lit the fires of his people, and when he died, his special torch was extinguished. In a letter to Pharaoh Akhenaten, a Hittite king addresses him as "my son," the great Bil-fire torch. See The Phoenician Origin of Britons, Scots, and Anglo-Saxons by Lawrence Augustine Waddell. In the story of Meleager, his lifespan is determined by the time it will take for a certain brand to burn away. There was a billet of wood, writes Ovid, in Metamorphosis, Book 8, which, when the daughter of Thestius lay in childbirth, the three sisters threw into the fire, and, spinning the threads of life with firm pressed thumb, they sang, "An equal span of life we give to thee and to this wood, O babe new born." In order to preserve her son, the mother snatched the blazing brand from the fire, and quenched it in water, but later, when her son had displeased her, she consigned it once again to the flames, and when it was altogether consumed, he died. Sir James Frazer tells us that in Uganda, the fire is put out when the king dies, and his death is announced as, "The fire has gone out." See The Golden Bow by Sir James Frazer, Volume 2, The Magic Arts, page 261. Diodorus Siculus records that the sacred fires of Persia were extinguished at the king's death, in Diodorus Siculus, Book 17, 114. In Sparta, the kings had a special officer known as a fire-bearer, whose duty it was to carry the flame into battle like a standard. See The Golden Bow, Volume 2, The Magic Art, page 264. In Greek art, Professor James Clark says that death was sometimes symbolized by a youth with an inverted torch. See The Dance of Death by James Clark. Monsieur Franz Humont, in his book The Mysteries of Mithra, writes as follows: "They, the monarchs, ruled by the grace of the creator of heaven and earth. The Iranians pictured this grace as a sort of supernatural fire, as a dazzling aureole, or nimbus of glory, which belonged especially to the gods, but which also shed its radiance upon princes and consecrated their powers. The Havareno, as the Avesta calls it, illuminated legitimate sovereigns and withdrew its light from usurpers, as from impious persons." Then on another page he continues, "The celestial fire which shines among the stars, always victorious over darkness, has as its emblem the inextinguishable fire that burned in the palace of the Caesars, and which was carried before them in official ceremonies. This lamp, constantly lighted, had also served the Persian kings as an image of the perpetuity of their power, and it passed with the mystical ideas of which it was the expression to the Diadochi, and from them to the Romans. In Ireland all fires were extinguished by the Druids on the eve of Samhain, and the king then lit the new flame at Tara. According to the Brehon laws, neither gold nor silver might redeem from the death penalty he who dared to light a fire before the king had done so. See A Smaller Social History of Ancient Ireland by P.W. Joyce, page 90. For certain offenses, men were excommunicated, and thereafter no member of the tribe might give the outlaw fire on pain of similar excommunication. See Druidism by Dudley Wright. We can see, therefore, why the cauldron of Hades would not cook the food of a coward or a man forsworn. In plain language, it would not provide him with the fire on which to do his cooking. To return to the lighting of the king's fire, when St. Patrick arrived in Ireland, he kept alight the candle upon the altar of his little church on the hill of Slane. It was visible to the Druids at Tara, and when all their fires had been extinguished in preparation for the ritual of the king rekindling the flame, St. Patrick's light continued to burn. Whereat the Druids cried out, O king, unless this fire which you see be quenched this same night, it will never be quenched, and the kindler of it will overcome us all and seduce all the folk of your realm. The king and the Druids thereupon mounted their chariots and drove to Slane. But St. Patrick and his companies escaped death by being miraculously, but fortunately only temporarily, changed into stags. See The Life of St. Patrick by Professor J.B. Bury. A special torch was borne by the powerful and princely chiefs of Ireland as late as the 16th century A.D. It was known as a rishinel, or king candle, and was of enormous size, with a great bushy wick. It burned at night in the royal presence. In the palace it was placed over the chief's head. During war it blazed outside his tent door. On night marches it was borne before him. This custom is mentioned very often in the records, and in The Four Masters is described Shane O'Neill's bodyguard in the 16th century. Shane was the mighty chief of Tyrone, with whom Queen Elizabeth negotiated, and in front of his tent burned a great fire, and a huge torch, thicker than a man's body, was constantly flaring at a short distance from the fire. See A Smaller Social History of Ancient Ireland by P.W. Joyce, pages 27 and 371. We can scarcely doubt but that the oriflamme, meaning the golden flame, which was borne by the Frankish kings into battle, was not originally a silken banner with an embroidered flame, but a torch of living fire. I have left until last the references to such a custom in the Old Testament, because they are the most interesting to us. In 2 Samuel 21:17 we find, Then the man of David sware unto him, saying, Thou shalt go no more out with us to battle, that thou quench not the light of Israel. And 1 Kings 11:36 gives, And unto his son will I give one tribe, that David my servant may have a light alway before me in Jerusalem. Job 18:5 is more explicit. Yea, the light of the wicked shall be put out, and the spark of his fire shall not shine. The light shall be dark in his tabernacle, and his candle shall be put out with him. Other references to the same practices will be found in 2 Kings 8:19, Job 21:17, Proverbs 13:9, and 24:20. Finally, we have the verses of 2 Chronicles 21:7. He, the Lord, promised to give a light to him, David, and to his sons forever. And of Psalm 132:17. I have ordained a lamp for mine anointed. These verses describe an actual contemporary Hebrew ritualistic practice, which foreshadowed and prophesied the coming of the Messiah, whose sanctuary lamp lights our Christian churches today. It is not necessary to enter here into long explanations of Sir James Frazer's theories concerning the cult of a dying and reviving god of vegetation and light. Briefly, the theory is that the god was represented by the king. The virility of the king was therefore thought to influence the growing corn. In the yearly course of the sun, the king, the divine youth, was for that reason sacrificed yearly, or at any rate before his vigor departed. As civilization advanced, he won free from such a fate, at first by the substitution of a slave, and finally by the substitution of a scapegoat. In the course of time, the life and term of office of the divine youth was prolonged, and therefore a gradual dissociation between the yearly fire-kindling feasts of Beltane, Samhain, or St. John's Eve, in the person of the king came about, until at length some sacred fires were thought by the common folk to be never extinguished, and they were therefore called perpetual fires. But actually they were not perpetual. Ovid tells us that the calends of March were really the beginning of the year when the withered laurel is withdrawn from the Ilian hearth, that Vesta also make a brave show, dressed in fresh leaves. Besides, 'tis said that a new fire is lighted in her secret shrine, and the rekindled flame gains strength. Ovid, Fasti 3:135. Solinus attests the same fact about Vesta's fire. Solinus, chapter 2. When the life of the king was no longer forfeit, and the offices of king and priest had been divided, it is probable that the priests, perhaps with the help of the king, kindled a sacred fire yearly, while the king's special torch remained unextinguished for the period of his life. If Vesta's fire went out by accident, the virgins were whipped by the Pontifex Maximus, and were compelled to rub a board of wood with a borer to produce fire by friction. But the whipping shows, I think, that the task was a punishment for carelessness. The inference that the annual relighting was effected, as at Delphi and Athens from the rays of the sun, remains good. See Festus, S.V. Ignis, page 106, C.O. Muller. Remembering that Arthur's sword is always called the brand Excalibur, and that any magic sword is generally likened in the French manuscript to unbranded de feu, I must now take a big jump and assert that the magic sword Excalibur, identical with the sword of the Grail, is nothing else but the king's torch, which at Arthur's death was extinguished in the water of the mere by Sir Bedivere. The reader will have the opportunity of judging whether the evidence I shall now give bears this out. To obtain that evidence, we must go as far afield as Iceland and the Norse myths, but this is not really so far from the Near Eastern source of the Grail legends as might at first be supposed. While mirrors and glasses were still venerated as sacra in the temples of Delphi and Athens and Rome, nevertheless, some centuries before the Christian era, an increasing familiarity with the laws of nature and science, particularly in Greek, led mathematicians to regard the behavior of light from a scientific as well as from a mystical standpoint, so that Archimedes in the 3rd century BC used a reflective mirror to set the Roman fleet on fire, and even earlier Aristophanes made casual mention of a burning glass in the clouds. Plutarch's account of how the sacred fire was lit at Delphi, where he was a priest, is illustrative of how both the scientific and mystical approach to light could exist in the same mind at the same time, for he speaks of a flame as being unpolluted, and yet cannot resist a mathematical explanation of the angles of reflection. No such scientific study of the subject occurred amongst northern peoples, who continued to regard the phenomenon of fire from heaven as the supreme and divine mystery until superseded by the Christian mysteries. The farther away a country is from the source of its culture, the longer are the myths preserved in their original form, and thus Iceland and Britain both acted as sounding boards, which echoed back the old tales long after the people of the Mediterranean had begun to speak first of mathematics and optics, and then of the gospel story. The most archaic versions of the Norse myths are to be found, therefore, not in Germany or Scandinavia, but in Iceland, and the earliest manuscript is the Poetic Edda of the 13th century, but it was probably first written down in the 9th, that is to say before Iceland became a Christian country. As many of the original Icelandic settlers were drawn from Britain, these lays are recognized to have been influenced by Celtic myth. See the foreword to Olive Bray's translation of the Poetic Edda. In about AD 1222, Snorri Sturluson wrote the prose Edda, which was a kind of commentary on the Poetic Edda. and an instruction to skalds on how to compose such metrical lays. Snorri, a Christian, must have been something of an antiquarian, for his advice to would-be skalds concerns not so much the laws of meter as the rules for preserving the old legends intact. His view was that a poet, although Christian, might compose new songs about the old pagan heroes, but that he might not tamper with the canon of ancient tradition, and that he must first understand and then continue to employ the traditional synonyms, similes, and paraphrases by which certain characters or objects in these myths were recognized by reference to their adventures. From Snorri, we learn that the Norse gods came from Troy by way of the Danube Valley. Odin, he says, was descended from Priam, whose daughter had a child called Thor. Thor was fostered in Thrace, and 17 generations divided him from his descendant Odin. Odin was the All-Father. The earth was his daughter and his wife. On her he begot the first son, which is Asa Thor. Then he and his people left the east and came to Saxland. Snorri seems to ascribe a human origin to Odin, and yet to assign to him the powers of the All-Father. But if we try to separate history from myth, we arrive at the probable truth that the traders of the Danubian route brought with them their Trojan gods. Now, Snorri shows us very clearly that in his day the skalds still enjoyed a sort of Freemasonry, whereby words served as Masonic signals between one brother poet and another. It was, no doubt, a delightful game, comparable to our crossword puzzles, and it must have lent them some self-importance. It is certain that without Snorri's explanation, a large part of the Elder or Poetic Edda would have been incomprehensible to the modern reader. Every skald, he tells us, must use the art of periphrasis, and use it, moreover, in the traditional way. Thus, to choose my own analogy, we must not call a spade, but rather that which caused Adam's brow to sweat. If the reader happened to be unacquainted with the story of the fall in Genesis, he would be entirely at a loss. Snorri gives us a list of the traditional modes of periphrasis, together with the legendary adventures which explain them. For instance, the Jazi was a mighty man, and his father possessed much gold. When he died, the giant and his 2 brothers inherited the hoard, and in order to guard it, carried it about in their mouths. And, writes Snorri, we have it as a metaphor among us now, to call gold the mouth-tail of these giants, but we conceal it in secret terms or in poesy in this way, that we call it speech, or word, or talk of these giants. Then said Aegir, I deem that well concealed in secret terms. All quotations from the Prose Edda of Snorri are taken from the translation of A.G. Brodeur, Ph.D. To quote one more example from Snorri, Aegir asked, what manner of metaphor is used for skaldic writing? 3 are the types of skaldic metaphor, answered Bragi. Thus, first, calling everything by its name. The second type is that which is called substitution. The third type of metaphor is that which is called periphrasis. Amongst Snorri's list of traditional substitutions, he tells us that swords are called Odin's fires, and he explains the origin of the substitution as follows. And at evening, when it was time for drinking, Odin had swords brought into the hall, so bright that light radiated from them, and other illumination was not used while they sat drinking. Snorri was a Christian writing a late 13th century commentary on pagan myths. It is not therefore surprising that in this instance he got his substitution the wrong way round, for he should have said that fires were called Odin's swords. He made the same mistake when explaining the substitution used for gold. Wherefore he asks, is gold called Aegir's fire? And he answers, Aegir, or Aegir, who gave a banquet to his fellow gods, had bright gold brought in onto the floor of the hall, and the gold gave forth light and illumined the hall like fire, and it was used there for lights at his banquet, even as in Valhalla swords were used in place of fire. We shall meet often with this last substitution of gold for fire, and it will be remembered that in the Mabinogion, Peridur's serpent stone had the property of producing as much gold as was desired. But now let us return to Odin's sword. In the hall of Volsung grew a big oak tree, and the limbs of the tree blossomed fair out of the roof of the hall, while below stood the trunk within, and the said trunk did men call Brandstock. See the Volsunga Saga, translated from the Icelandic by Eirikur Magnusson and William Morris. It was in this tree that Odin had thrust his sword ready for the hero who could draw it out. In modern language, we should say that the property of fire was hidden deep within the wood, and that man had not yet learnt to draw out the fire. The brandstock derives from the same Teutonic root which gives the words brand, burn, etc., and the name simply means the fire tree. The most primitive way of making fire is to rub two sticks together, and this was generally effected by a bore of hard wood twirled in a cup-shaped matrix of softwood. And these two parts of the fire drill were, for obvious reasons, conceived to be of different sexes, male and female. In archaic ritual, therefore, it was thought fitting that a woman should hold and steady the matrix, while the man employed the bore. And this is the practice amongst certain primitive tribes today. See The Golden Bough by Sir James Frazer, Volume 2, The Magic Arts, page 208. Thus, the earliest myths will tell us how the magic sword was drawn from a tree, and generally by a man and a woman. Odin's sword was drawn forth from the brandstock by Volsung's son, Sigmund, and his sister wife, Signy. The story of how they drew forth not only the brand, but also the wrath of the gods upon their heads, just as did Prometheus when he stole fire from Olympus, is well known to those who are familiar with Wagner's opera cycle of The Ring. Sigmund's sword is broken, that is to say, extinguished by the power of the All-Father, who takes upon himself the characteristics of Thor, god of thunder and lightning. The rain and storm and the spear of lightning quench the poor little brand of primitive man. It is a well-known superstition that lightning will put out fire. To explain how the brand was next mended or renewed, we must return to how Arthur first got the sword Excalibur, and to Malory's account of how there was found a great stone 4 square, like to a marble stone, and in the midst thereof like an anvil of steel, a foot of height, and therein stuck a fair sword. This stone, though Malory was almost certainly unaware of the meaning of the legends he was transcribing, is really a description of a flint, a stone used as an anvil, on which iron striking will produce a spark. And Arthur handed the sword by the handles, and lightly and fiercely he pulled it out of the stone, whereat he was proclaimed the only rightful king of Britain, or, more accurately, because he was the rightful king, he kindled a king's torch. As we shall presently see, this was not the only fashion in which the sword could be mended, for Malory gives us another example of the finding of Excalibur, in which Arthur draws it from the Lady of the Lake. So far we have dealt only with the more primitive ways of making fire by friction or percussion, and both these methods necessitate the action and intervention of man, and were thought to be effected by the conjunction of a male and female element in the materials used. For in the Iranian scriptures of Zoroaster, it is laid down that the stone of Mother Earth is female, and that metal, on the contrary, is male. It says, see The Bible of the World, edited by Robert O. Ballou. Since civilization spread from the Near East, the belief that stone and iron had these sexual qualities was probably common to most primitive peoples. It is often maintained that the earliest iron to be worked was meteoric iron. The Egyptians called it always Ba Nepet, the metal of heaven, even when eventually imported and well known. See Zeus by A.B. Cook, Volume 3, page 922, Note 9. The point of contact of iron on stone was therefore not only the union of male and female, but of celestial and terrestrial, and the spark which resulted from the fall of a primitive iron axe upon stone may perhaps explain the adoption of the axe as a sacred emblem in the Near East. Nevertheless, fire produced from percussion necessitated a great deal of activity on the part of man, whereas the more man could eliminate any human action in the production of fire, the more he would feel that this divine brightness came directly and miraculously to him from the gods. Far more desirable, therefore, than fire drills or iron and flint was a talisman which merely by holding it to the sun would draw down fire from heaven. Any vessel which could thus receive the sun's rays and beget the fire child, without an intervention of an earthly male element, was thought of as a virgin vessel. We have seen that this receptacle of light could be either a metal mirror or a crystal. But there is a third kind of virgin vessel, and the Grail legend bears this out. Arthur goes to the Grail castle and there sees a sacra of its mysteries, and the history testifies that there was not at that time in the whole of Great Britain either sic a chalice. The Grail then appeared at the consecration of the Mass in 3 ways. The king was well pleased to see what he saw, and he took into his memory the name of the chalice and the form, and he commanded to make the like in every way in his dominion, for serving God the more honorably. In E. Saint Grail, or Y. Saint Grail, the Welsh version of the quest, translated into English by Reverend Robert Williams, pages 673 and 685. What was this third method of focusing sunlight? It was the means whereby Arthur drew Excalibur out of the water, for there is no more powerful way of focusing than by a hollow glass sphere filled with water, as many scientists have found to their cost when a large retort has been left in the sun, and the laboratory has gone up in flames. That this phenomenon was known to the ancients is proved by references in Lactantius. See the article by H. C. Beck in Antiquaries Journal, Volume 8, 327, and by Pliny, who says first that vessels and glass have been brought to a marvelous degree of resemblance to crystal. Pliny, Natural History, Book 37, Chapter 10. And secondly, that we find that globular glass vessels filled with water, when brought in contact with the rays of the sun, become heated to such a degree as to cause articles of clothing to ignite. Pliny, Natural History, Book 36, Chapter 67. That in drawing Excalibur from the Lady of the Lake, Arthur was drawing fire out of water, is supported by the following references. Pliny says that at Dodona the spring of Zeus is cold and puts out torches that are plunged in it, but kindles such as are put out are brought near to it. Pliny, Natural History, Book 2, 106, 228. Wolfram tells us that Parzival's sword, which Amphratus gave him, as ye once in this tale did hear, sprang asunder one while, yet 'twas welded afresh in the mystic spring. Jesse Weston's translation of Parzival, page 252. In the poem known as the Chair of Taliesin by the Welsh bard, a boat of glass, and as we shall see later, that such a boat is globular or coracle-shaped, is in the hands of a stranger, a sign whereby he is known as an initiate and admitted to the mysteries, with priests of intelligence to officiate on behalf of the moon, in the concourse of associated men, under the open breeze of the sky, with the maceration and sprinkling in the boat of glass in the hand of the stranger, and the stout youth with pitch. I have used the translation of Edward Davies in his Mythology and Rites of the British Druids, page 277. The pitch, of course, refers to the torch. It will be necessary to go more deeply into the science and dates of glass blowing in a later chapter, but it is time now to postulate that what was the actual ritual practiced in this fire cult, and more important, what was the spiritual meaning which underlay it. The virgin vessel was a symbol of earth, of Kor, or Kore, the maiden. At the close of summer it was solemnly entombed in a real cave of Hades, beyond a real Styx. When springtime came, the divine youth had to ford the subterranean stream at crossable peril, and brave the truly awful depths of such an underworld. Having suffered this ordeal, he then won the symbol of the maiden, and carried it in a priestly procession to the top of a tor or hill, where the rays of the morning sun passed through it to light this torch and symbolize his incarnation and consecration as a son of the sun. Before going on to give further evidence of this ritual, let us consider its significance. Some readers may feel that such a practice might very well explain the Celtic cauldron. Others may feel a certain disappointment and even repugnance in supposing that the Grail, which has always been associated with our Lord, and which was called forth from so many poets, the highest expression of their art and faith, is no more than the sacrum of a fire cult. I would like, therefore, at this point, to reassure such readers that any loss they may feel now will, I hope, be made good before the end of this book. To rob men of anything holy and leave the world disenchanted and empty of romance is the devil's business. But, on the other hand, truth can be more inspiring than any man-made fancy. I believe, and scriptural authority supports me, that the behavior of light was foreordained as a symbol, whereby we might have some faint idea of the relation of God to Christ, the light of the world. And if we pursue our quest to the end, Christians will find the symbolism as beautiful in its own way as the medieval legend of the cup of the Last Supper. For just as light from the sun descends to ignite the torch, so the fire of the Holy Ghost proceeds forth from God and becomes incarnate in the Son of Man. Anyone is, of course, free to argue that God does not exist, and that man has invented the whole idea of deity by drawing false conclusions from the behavior of light. But it is just as logical to suppose that God created the behavior of light in order to teach men about God. For the sake of brevity, I shall in the future use the phrase foreordained symbolism, or picture writing. Then I want the reader to understand that the rhythm of the sun's course in the seasons, the recurrence of dawn and sunset, and the behavior of light and its refraction were not what gave birth to the idea of the dying and reviving God, but that on the contrary, the Creator set lights in the firmament for signs, for the purpose of preparing man for the advent of his Son. He could have created quite a different pattern, rhythm, and behavior in the sky had he so chosen. To return to the hope that my explanation of the Grail legend will not disenchant but rather inspire the Christian reader, if it can be shown that such a ritual, as I have described, was both widespread and extremely ancient. It would surely disprove forever the conclusions of Sir James Frazer in The Golden Bough, that all religious feeling was activated by the lowest motives, the desire for food, corn, and the preservation and reproduction of the human species. If I am right, there was never a time when some man did not raise his head, and, beholding the beauty of descending light, longed to be endowed with it, stretching up his hands in anticipation of the descent of the Holy Ghost. An early Chaldean prayer to Diable, the god of fire, went thus: Cause then the limbs of man, the son of his God, to shine. Make him to be bright like the sky. Make he shine like the earth. Make he be bright like the interior of the heavens. The Dawn of Civilization by Professor Gaston Maspero, page 636. At the heart of the old religions which spread from the Near East was the apprehension that there was only the one God, the Creator, and though he might delegate some of his powers to attendant archangels or punitive demons, who were numbered as gods, he remained supreme. Opinions varied not so much according to the country or climatic conditions as according to the individual temperament, whether a man saw the Creator in the terrifying forces of nature, such as thunder, storm, and lightning, or in the benevolent light of the sun. But the thunder of Rimmon, Jupiter, or Odin was only the wrathful face of the same Creator sky god who could smile as Ra, Shamash, Apollo, Frey, or Lot. In Egypt, Ra was addressed as O thou only one, O thou perfect one, O thou who art eternal, and as divine youth, who art self-created. I cannot comprehend thee. Thou art the Lord of heaven and earth, and didst create beings celestial and beings terrestrial. See The Book of the Dead, printed as a pamphlet by the British Museum, 1920. In the Indian epic the Mahabharata, the hero Yudhishthira prays, O Sun, thou art the eye of the universe, the soul of all things that are. Thou art the Creator. Thou art Indra. Thou art Vishnu. Thou art Brahma. Thou art Prajapati, Lord of creatures, Father of gods and men. Thou art fire. Thou art mind. Thou art Lord of all, the eternal Brahma. See Indian Myth and Legend by Donald A. Mackenzie. The Christian world is still divided into those who, by temperament, see God more easily in the wrath and thunder of Jehovah, and those who behold him in the compassionate face of Christ, the light of the world. To these last, the secrets of Camelot will, I think, be welcome, for Arthur's Camelot and the ancient British town of Camulodunum both take their names from the Celtic camu, or bent, and laud, light, and it is the secret of how to bend the rays, not of light, but of the Spirit, and to bring down the flame of the Spirit into our hearts, for which we are all seeking.